I saw Howard's End again at Cannes, and I thought, here's a film that has not mellowed with age, but become sharper and richer with social critique. And I thought, wow, this is like a new experience for me. And I'm so thrilled that the film is going to be re-released. I wanted to ask you a couple of things about the difference between the book and the film. One thing that really struck me is that the book is told in the third person and with letters, but there's no narration in your version of Howard's End. And I was wondering if you would just speak about that. Let me just give you an example. The book opens with the words something like, it all began, we should begin with the letters. Right. And the letters are from Helen, who's writing from Howard's End to her sister, Margaret. And in the film, it opens with a sequence of Vanessa Redgrave. She's shot from behind and she's walking through a field and it's twilight. She walks around to a house. We find out later it's Howard's End. She looks in the window, there is a group gathering. So it's established that she's somewhat of an outsider and you don't know who she is at first. And there's no words spoken in the first few minutes of your film until we hear Margaret reading the letter that her sister Helen, and it starts off, I'm having a glorious time.
Dearest Meg, I'm having a glorious time. The fun of it is that they think me a noodle. And say so. At least Miss Wilcox does. Oh, Meg, shall we ever learn to talk less?
You've done a fascinating job of concision and also establishing some of the characters. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that.
Well, we were able to give a little bit of what happened to Helen. The next thing we see is that Helen and the younger Wilcox son, Paul, go under a tree and kiss. And so that's set up, that there's some kind of romance there. Yes. I mean, they're, kissing, not wildly passionate, but certainly, more than affection, let's say. And then it starts with the letter being read by the sister in London. And I mean, it was one way to visually tell the story. Well, what happened to Helen? What was, that's why we did it that way.
Yes. And also, again, it establishes the kind of eccentric person that Ruth Wilcox is in a way. Because why is she walking alone at night, trailing her dress?
But she's happy to be there.
Yes.
She loves it.
Yes.
She loves it. It's her house and her people.
Yes.
That's why.
Yeah. You came to Howard's End. Howard's End is your third Forster novel adaptation. Right. How did that come about? In the sense that, did you always want to do Howard's End, or
no?
Okay.
No, I didn't. And it was Ruth. Well, we'd done A Room with a View, and then we did Morris. Meanwhile, Passage to India was made by David Lean. Mm-hmm. And Ruth thought that since Howard's End had not been purchased by anybody and nobody had any plans to make it, we really ought to make it ourselves. And she actually said, it's a sort of mountain that you have to climb now. Merchant Ivory has to climb. Yes. And you should get in there and try and make that film. And I remember that I had read Howard's End twice over the years. I couldn't remember anything about it except for one scene that I remembered. And there's a scene in the novel, and it's not in the film, in which Charles and Margaret are driving down a country road in his open car. And they come into a little village very fast and continue on down the road. And there's a thump in the car, and they run over something, maybe a dog or a cat, you don't know what. And she tries to get Charles to stop and turn around and go back, and he won't. He just keeps on driving and even puts his foot on the gas to go faster. And he hates Margaret because she's soon to be his new stepmother. At which point Margaret stands up in the open car and just leaps out onto the side of the road. And I remember that as being, to me, that was a thrilling scene. Yes. And it's the only scene I remembered from the first two readings of Howard's End. Well, it was in the script, and we tried to shoot that scene. But you can't shoot a scene like that. How can you show a car running over a dog? You can't show that.
That's
No-
absolutely the case, yes.
You cannot. And I hadn't thought it through. And it never occurred to me, well, how are we going to show this? I just didn't think about it. That was the only scene I remembered from reading the book. So I read it a third time, and I thought, yeah, I could do this. This is good. I like this. Why not?
You know, well, you do have Margaret's kind of impetuousness in a scene that's not in the book, where Henry proposes to her and she kisses him.
I'm asking you to be my wife.
So that's in a way an equivalent, perhaps, you know, to her showing her passion, or her,
Right.
you know, that she might be very restrained on the surface and very proper, but beware, she's one
Well,
tough cookie. You
yeah,
know,
she was a tough cookie.
The other aspect that's for me different from the book is that I find the treatment of Leonard much more sympathetic than Forster's, who says in the book that Leonard, in fact, he didn't think himself inferior to the Wilcoxes and the Schlegels, but Forster says, but he was, because he was on the genteel end of poverty.
Right.
And there was something a little more insufferable about Leonard in the book, but he becomes a fairly sympathetic figure in your film, and I'm just wondering, did Ruth and
That
you
was
and
that
Ishmael-
was an important point with Ruth. She felt that Forster didn't really know people like Leonard, or have much sympathy for them. It was easy for him to identify, say, with the Schlegel sisters, you know, advanced, middle-class, educated women, and he could identify with them, but he had a problem identifying with working-class people.
Richard was walking hurriedly. A pale grey light on the skirts of the flying tempest displayed the dawn. Did you see the dawn?
Yes, suddenly it got light.
And was it wonderful?
No.
So Ruth felt we had to strengthen him, which she did from the very beginning. I mean, it's not that she rewrote the part or anything, and the very same thing happens to him that in the book as in the film. I mean, eventually he's killed. Yes. But, yeah, she needed to make him more sympathetic and truer, and as I say, more believable as a person, and that you would feel more of an empathy with him.
Yes,
And that was definitely one of the things she set out to do.
Mm-hmm. It's and also interesting to me that your film was like a family affair with some of the actors, given Vanessa's niece plays Evie Wilcox, and Prunella Scales, who's so wonderful at Aunt Jolie. Her son is Samuel West, who plays Leonard Bast. What was it like working with family?
Well, you know, Prunella Scales hadn't become family, and she was suggested by our casting agent, Celestia Fox, who'd cast a lot of our English films, in fact, all of them, from Room with a View on. I mean, she found almost everybody. Not Vanessa, I found Vanessa. I also found Emma as well.
All right, because basically Howard Zed made Emma the international star she became, because what was she in beforehand? Dead Again, which was okay, but it was not the success.
Yeah, she won the Academy Award for it.
Yes, it was an amazing success, because you guys were nominated for 9 Academy Awards.
Right, we were.
Yeah, and you won 3, which was really great. Could you talk about the casting of Emma as Margaret Schlegel?
Sure. There were several actresses that I met, including Tilda Swinton, actually. And then Emma came, and she didn't read from the script. She just read from the novel. In fact, I think she hadn't seen the script. She was the last to come, and she just took up the novel, and I found a place for her to read something, and she read it, and that was it. I thought, well, this is Margaret. I don't need to go any further or see anybody else.
Did you have any arguments with your producer about?
None.
Okay.
No.
Great.
He never argued about actors, but sometimes he jumped in and was determined to cast somebody. Like he was determined to cast Helena Bonham Carter as Helen.
Yes.
Well, why not? That was great.
Yes,
It
was.
and he did that in several other films. He cast Maggie Smith in Room with a View, not me.
Yeah.
And he cast her also in Quartet years before. Mm-hmm. He just liked Maggie Smith. Well, who's going to complain? Yes. And he cast James Mason in Autobiography of a Princess. Yes. Well, who's going to complain?
Yes.
So,
oh, that's great. And by the time Emma was cast, did you have the other cast members in place, or did you then cast around?
We knew Tony Hopkins was going to do it, and I knew that I wanted Vanessa. There could only be one person who could play Mrs. Wilcox, which was Vanessa.
Howard's End was almost pulled down once. It would have killed me. It's my house, you know. It was left to me by my brother who died out in India. I love it so.
I didn't want James Wilby to play the elder brother, Charles, because in Morris he had a scene in which he was particularly nasty to one of his sisters. And I remember when we were making it and when I saw the rushes, I thought he'd be a very good villainous type. And so when we came to do Howard's End, I cast him.
The other star of the film, of course, is Howard's End. The first words of the book are something like, Howard's End is red brick, small, but delightful. And that apparently it became part of the Bloomsbury Circle at one point.
It had been.
Yes.
Yes, and that famous Lady Adeline Morrill had lived there. And the story was that she would let the lovers in through a skylight in her bedroom in the house. And that was the story. Yeah, it had been owned by her and her husband. And now it was owned by some people who were very, very nice English people who were incredibly hospitable while we were making it. And he was a dealer and an expert on old silver. And you know, the film was funded by Japanese, and they assumed that there was going to the house, Howard's End, would be some extraordinary and fabulous pile, you know, some great English country house like Blenheim or something, like a palace. And then they saw this little sort of farmhouse, which was kind of, you know, it went back and back and back, but it was not very impressive. And, well, they couldn't say anything because they're also polite, but that's where we were.
And Wickham Place was Victoria Square? You used
Yeah. And we found a house there that we wanted to use, which I think is gone now. I think they tore all that down. That whole square was torn down, I think.
But where Margaret and Henry have lunch at Simpson's on the Strand.
That's still very much there, yeah. I was thinking the other day when I was in London, I thought I wouldn't mind going back to Simpson's, and food's really good. And then, but I looked up and you couldn't wear this and you couldn't wear that and you had to do this, and had all the usual ancient rules of English civilized behavior.
Because Howard's End is about as English a film as you could get, even though it's made by an American.
But it's written by a subversive Englishman.
Yes,
Don't forget. It's interesting about Ian Forster because when we started to do our Forster films, I met people in England, older people, who had bad feelings about him. It wasn't so much that he had been gay, it wasn't that kind of thing, but that he had written about England and the English middle class in a way that rankled.
Have you actually brought 2 starving people from London to Shropshire?
There was a restaurant car on the train.
Don't be absurd. I won't have such theatrical nonsense. How dare you? Yes, how dare you?
And then there's the thing he said that he would prefer to betray his country rather than his friend. Yeah. He actually said that in one of the things that he wrote. Well, I think he said it in wartime.
Well,
so that people were remembering that. And I really felt in England that there was not the affection for Ian Forster's books that Americans have.
So was it difficult to get the rights to any of his books?
Not at all. Not at all. Forster didn't want any of his novels to be made into film, so he allowed the rights to be, he allowed, you know, Passage to India to be a play. Now, Satyajit Ray wanted to make Passage to India at one point, and he went to see Forster, and they met, and Forster liked Patra Panchali, but he still said no. He didn't want to do that. And it's interesting because, and then Ray went on with that idea for a while until he'd been totally, you know, discouraged by Forster. Ismail was going to produce it, and Vanessa Redgrave would have played Adela. Then he died, and we had just our film Heat and Dust had just opened in London. It was a big, big success, which of course takes place at about the same time as Passage to India, in mid-20s India. And we had a message from King's College, who owned the rights to all of Forster's work. And they asked us whether we would like to come up and have lunch. So Ismail and I traveled up to Cambridge, and we had lunch, and they did in fact offer us Passage to India. And would we like to make it? But I by that time we decided we wanted to make A Room with a View. And I didn't want to make Passage to India for two reasons. First of all, Ray wanted to do it, so it seemed to me it would be wrong, and he was still alive, and it would be wrong for me to then do it.
Yes.
Secondly, we just made a film about the British Raj.
Yes.
It's the heat and dust.
Yes,
It was in the theaters.
Yes.
So we said, well, what we'd really like to do is Room with a View. And they looked astonished. That little novel, that little ordinary novel, you want to do Room with a View and you're going to have Passage to India? And we said, yes, that's what we want. So they had to think about it a bit, but after not too long, they said fine, and they allowed us to do it. Well, and then, of course, it was all right for it to be made by
David Lean.
Yeah, David Lean.
Yeah.
And Ruth and David Lean were at exactly the same time writing the screenplays in the same place in Delhi. He was in Delhi writing Passage to India, and she was in Delhi writing A Room with a View. She said, I absolutely know who has the better book. Meaning he had.
How did you guys work with Ruth? I mean, so it's decided that you're going to make Howard's End. Does she go off, take the book, go off, and then a few months later come with the screenplay?
Pretty much. It wasn't always like that. If we were working on something together, which we sometimes did, if we were co-script writers, we had a different way of working. But if she was doing it on her own, she would take the book, usually my marked up book, and I would write, I must have this scene, and this is fabulous, and stuff like that. And she had my marked up book.
Yeah.
And then she would just work on it and work with it for several months. Not always, sometimes she'd be in New York, sometimes she'd be in Delhi. And we'd communicate if we had to say anything about it while she was doing it. I mean, she would, occasionally she'd write or say something. But normally she just was completely on her own. And then she would give me and Ismail the finished script. And then we read it, and then I'd stamp and shout and say, but where's that scene? I think that's my favorite scene, and you cut it, and things like that. And then, we'd at that point, we'd go back and forth a bit over, and she would put in things that I was very keen on. And I would listen to her reasons for doing certain things, and, usually, her reasons were very, very good, always, very to the point. And that would have been stupid to, override her and very much.
I also noted that Ruth said that she kind of is fearful of too much dialogue. So she writes scenes where the images are suggestive, as it should be in any good movie.
She always was fearful about too much dialogue, and that started with the very first film we made, which was The Householder. And she couldn't believe her eyes or ears when she saw the first cut of the film, because people were talking, and she was horrified. And I don't know, we tossed out so much of the dialogue in that film, and then from then on, she was very, very careful and suspicious of a lot of dialogue. But she was working with a director who likes dialogue. That's me. I like good dialogue very much, and I go for it.
I fear you may have thought our letter a little odd.
We're not odd, really. We're just over-expressive, that's all.
The more a lady has to say, the better.
I mean, I would always shoot more than she thought was needed. And sometimes I agreed, and once in a while I didn't.
And you worked very closely with your composer, Richard Robbins, as well. Yeah. And I know he did the score for Howard's End.
Right.
How would he score?
Well, what we would do, he would know before we shot what, most of our films have musical sections in them, which is source music. Someone's playing the piano, or they go to the opera, or whatever it is. There's source music that he gave his advice on what to have and what not to have. Or if it was piano music, what the actress or actor would be able to play.
Yes.
Very often, Helena was a marvelous pianist. She was not really a pianist, but she was a fantastic student. If she'd ever wanted to be a pianist, she would have been superb. Then, when the film was edited, he would see the first rough cut, and then we would start, cutting it down. But he would have seen the first rough cut, and then he would kind of get to work and begin to develop. And I'm sure, I know that he had all sorts of things already in mind. Came up with all kinds of ideas. And when finally the film was in its final form and at its proper length, whatever it was, he would then sit down and actually compose for it. And after he had something that he liked or he thought I would like, I would go and see him, and he'd play it along with the film. You never knew what he was going to do. I mean, I never did. I'm not a musician, so I wouldn't dream of telling him what to do.
The cinematographer you've worked with many times, right?
Tony Pierce Roberts.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you told me something I didn't know, in spite of all the research I thought I did on the film, was that you shot it in 70 millimeter.
We'd made all these films and period films, and we were thinking, well, what can we do now? You know, it's got to be sort of different. And so we came up with the idea of doing it in 70 millimeter. And I remember he wanted to use a punchier film stock, is the way he put it. And we would abandon Fuji, which we'd used for years and years and years on all our other films, and we went to Kodak. Kodak had more contrast and just brighter colors or something.
Was the film ever, were there any theatrical engagements in 70 millimeter?
Many. They were all of them were. I mean, the big ones were. Yeah, they made many prints. When it played in New York, at Paris, it was 70 millimeter, and in London, the same. And as I say, they made many prints. I mean, in the big cities where you could show 70 millimeter, there was a 70 millimeter print.
Great.
All of which have disappeared. No one knows where they are. I'm just hoping that Martin Scorsese has one. He's supposed to have every possible print of everybody. So,
where did the material come from on this recent restoration, which is?
From the original negative. You know, they take it out, and then first it has to be cleaned up.
Yes.
And they get all the dirt out and all the rest of it. And then it goes through a whole long process of being digitized and all that.
And that process was not done in Rochester, was it?
Well, the color corrections were done in London, but I think the digitizing of it was done here, I believe, in New York in Sênior.
Yes. And then did you and Tony look at the...
So he and I sat together and we went through the whole film, and he made the color corrections, and he had a couple of days to do that. And so that's why it looks so great.
Yes, and it does.
Yeah.
It does.
As I say, he could, it looks better than the film did when it was shown in 70 millimeter, because by the time you've made a dupe negative in 70 millimeter, you've already come a couple of stages away from the original negative. And so in terms of color and even maybe definition, you have something superior now with the 4K restoration.
Well, it is like a new work. When I originally saw it, I had not appreciated the strength of the social critique. Now it's much more evident. And I think that there is an audience that is pining for this type of cinema.
I hope so.
Because it is also very funny in spots. There's a great deal of humor in the film.
There is. Well, Forster was a master of irony and
an understatement.
And an understatement. It just has occurred to me, I'm reading a book about Roger Casement, who was the great Irish patriot and eventually was tried and executed for treason. But before all of that, he had gone to both Africa and South America to find out about what was happening to the indigenous people there who were involved in the manufacture or the harvesting of rubber. And terrible things were happening to them. I mean, the Belgians just monstrous things to the Congolese workers. Terrible things, cut off their hands. And I only just noticed the other day, there's that little scene where Wilcox and Margaret are dancing round and round in his office, and on the wall behind is a big map of Africa. Yes. And in fact, Wilcox was in the African rubber business. Now all this came out and was printed. There was all massive stuff in the press in England about what was happening in the Congo to people who working for the Belgians. Yes. Forster would have read that. Those companies were British companies. Was he imagining that Wilcox was one of those English owners?
Well, he could have actually.
And it only just occurred to me that he would have known all that, and so he made Wilcox you know, by several removes, a murderer of black people. I mean, did he show his disapproval that greatly? I mean, in terms of that character who he didn't have any fondness for.
I know. It's interesting to speculate about.
I can't help but speculate
about that.
having read that.
I mean, if his son kills a dog on the road, why not kill workers in
Right.
you know?
Right.
So it could be. I mean, Forrester seemed to be rather. I mean, he would not have approved of Wilcox in any way, but it's interesting how at the end of Howard's End, who inherits Howard's End?
Then I leave Howard's End to my wife, absolutely. This house, she intends at her death to leave to her nephew.
That's what he's really saying in the famous line that is not in the film, only connect.
Yes.
And what's connecting there is the working class and the educated class in the form of this child
Yes.
who would inherit this house.
After a whole rigmarole and brouhaha and terrific plotting, because the plot is sublime.
You know, Forster never thought much of his plots. He said they were little matchstick things propped up just ready to topple over. He said that about his own plots, and particularly Howard's End. You know, he did what he had to do as a fiction writer and to sort of keep it all moving and going, but he didn't have any great, he didn't think he'd done anything so wonderful.